Hi, Allison Zmuda here, and thank you so much for joining us for part two of our conversation with Ulcca Hansen. And we're chatting about her such a powerful book, The Future of Smart. Came out in September of 2021. So we'll go ahead and make sure that you have the links if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Ulcca or you want to purchase the book. Again, I can't recommend it highly enough, but we are going into part two, which is what I call the all hands on deck mindset of how we can continue to capture this very unique and precious moment that's in front of us in making a shift from an industrialized model of education, as Ulcca was describing at the tail end of part one, to a space where learning can actually look, feel, sound, and systemically work in perhaps very rich, adaptive, and inspiring ways. So Ulcca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So when we're starting to think about the idea of the all hands on deck mindset, what is the general vision that you'd like our audience members to sort of think through with us?
Wow, there's so many levels. So I'll take it at the highest possible level, which is our current thinking about education kind of separates young people from their lives, right? And we sort of take them and we put them in these boxes called classrooms and we say, well, this is where learning is going to happen. And they begin to take that mindset in that this is stuff I do in school and the rest of life is not it. And when you say like all hands on deck, could we imagine a world in which yes, it looks different at elementary versus middle versus high school, but actually, part of the work of education is to get young people back out into their communities, for all of us to see ourselves as part of young people's education because they belong to us, right, in our communities, and to really think about how do we expand our notions of what deep, purposeful, relevant learning looks like and build systems that are flexible enough to allow rich work to happen between educators and young people in spaces. Maybe it's classrooms, maybe it's other spaces, but then also invites the possibility of young people going out and experiencing that and driving those experiences in their world more broadly. And, how much richer a conception of education would we have, and how much better would we be at unleashing young people's passion, right, for making the world a better place at an earlier and earlier age.
That's interesting. And as part of my talking as a curriculum consultant, we talk about the idea of the school world and the real world, and I sort of jest that if the school world is different from the real world, at least it should be a little more magical than it is. You know what I mean? So
That's right.
that's right. So if we're going to have an alternate universe, like, can we actually start to think through and step back and say, how do we actually sort of collapse the walls between, the classroom walls and the walls outside from a networking point of view, from an inquiry point of view? But as you were speaking a moment ago, Ulcca, is the idea from where learning happens. So if learning truly is going to be this personalized 24/7, deep, investigative, and personalized approach, then ultimately learning doesn't stop at the end of the classroom period or at the end of the school day. Learning can actually happen in blocks of time that aren't neatly configured in school schedules and bus routes, but also trying to make sure that kids have an equitable opportunity, that some students are not slated in a very traditional structure and only a certain number of students, the ones that are sort of defined by a traditional metric of what success looks like, that they're all of a sudden green lighted to do interesting, and that there are other kids that are left behind. So I think that's another interesting dynamic from an all hands on deck mindset. How do we begin to imagine sort of the challenge of systems that are highly malleable but have equity as one of their ultimate aims?
This is where I think this idea of ecological systems versus human systems is super helpful. So even if you think about the human body when it's working really well, right, we have individual systems inside the body that maybe have particular resources at different times, but when there is need, the resources go to the system that needs it. If I'm, running a marathon, it's going to be my muscular system, right, that kind of gets it, my circulatory system. So I think what we're looking for is inspiration from ecological systems designs where we understand that there's adaptability and flexibility that allows us to respond in the appropriate way to the young person and their context. I mean, I'll tell you, one of my sons, we put him in this inquiry-based kind of place, and we can go into this, but it wasn't working as well as it could have. But I've also learned about him, like he wants direct instruction more than maybe I would think would be good for him. But he's like, that's how I learn and that's what I need. And so he needs to get that, right? And another kid might say, actually, I want to go and do my own thing. And that's where I think it's so important that we remember, these conversations about opening the walls is not about undervaluing educators. If anything, it makes our work so much more important because it's about very consciously transferring the ability to be aware of our learning, to know how to learn, to understand the dynamics of it to young people so that they own it and can drive it and sort of, spread their wings when they leave our classrooms and our places. And that's rich, complex work. And so schools and educators are always going to be needed as the place where the kind of magic of the learning how to learn happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the quotes that sort of just got me excited about the idea that all hands on deck mindset is this is deep collaborative work. It cannot be imposed from above or outside. It can't be implemented technocratically. It requires a change in our relationship, both with the idea and the practice of education. For a long time, there was no room in the mainstream conversation for this whole way of thinking about education, only a reform agenda. But something is shifting now. A window has opened. We need to recognize it for what it is, a conscious choice point. So let's unpack that a little bit. Can you talk about the notion of what you think is shifting now, the window that has been opened, and perhaps a project or two that actually is sort of a testament to that reality?
So I think about the window opening in a couple of different ways. I think it was opening even before COVID disrupted the world, in the sense that what I think of as more human-centered liberatory approaches to education, which is what you and I think, talk about and work within, they have always been countercultural. So you think about when the factory model of education was developed, the purpose wasn't to actually release and help every young person find their potential. That wasn't the point. But as the world has become more complex, more ambiguous, as knowledge doubles every 13 hours, right? What we need education to help young people become and learn how to do is very different. And so all of a sudden, what these produce and what the world needs have been converging, right? And I think that's more true every single year with the rate at which technology progresses. And as that was happening, what we heard was people saying, we can't do that. I mean, how could we not send kids to school, every day to learn? Or how could we not test kids every year in terms of knowing how they're doing? Or how could we not use SATs and ACTs for college entrance exams? And then COVID happened. And all of a sudden, it turns out we can do things differently. I think everyone is seeing that. I think parents got insights into their children's education and the ways that it was and was not learning and working. And I think young people have become even more vocal, right, about what they need. So when I think about the window in this moment, it's this convergence of factors of the world needs what this produces. People are seeing in new and deeper ways how it's just not adequate to kind of tinker with the industrial model, which is what I think, with the best of intentions, I think most of our reform efforts have been pretty much about kind of tinkering and making it better. And so we have this moment to have conversations in our classrooms, in our schools, in our communities that really bring in a wide range of stakeholders to say, what do we actually want for our students? And we've already started to do it. All the profiles of a graduate that schools have. I mean, there are no school districts that have a profile of a graduate that says every kid is going to get a 1600 on their SAT scores. That's not what they say. They say we want curious, collaborative, problem solvers who are innovative and flexible and adaptive. It's like, great. Now, let's ask ourselves honestly whether what we're doing every day with our kids is going to produce that. And in most cases, when people actually go and think about it and watch it, the answer is no. So it's like, all right, so how do we rebuild back? We're going to have to rebuild something post-COVID. So we may as well build towards, this 10-year broader vision than to sort of go back to what we need. Or what we've had.
It's so interesting too, because as you see in sort of national headlines right now, there are headlines that are actually potentially sort of drawing us back into a very different place. So headlines on just how much students have actually not performed, like the devastation of COVID on reading and math test scores, for example, or the idea of how much kids really are not as interested in being curious. So the same teacher doing the same thing pre-COVID is not having the same impact in terms of engaging in discourse and dialogue. And so trying to figure out in what ways has the COVID experience actually, and again, what you said, I agree 100% that we can do things without test scores. We can do things without everything being as structured as folks might have thought was necessary. But at the same time, the tuning into the real slippery slope of trying to accelerate something that we know is already broken. That's sort of what I'm balancing in my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important moment for us to not get into the either or, right? So I think, and we often do, we're like, oh, well, we don't want any test scores. We don't want any standardized kind of data. I'm like, there's nothing wrong with it. I think what the problem is how we've used it and made it become the primary thing. So I think it's a both and. I think this idea of where kids are, learning loss, I mean, everyone's talking about NAEP scores and everyone's, that's fascinating because that's a game we've created, right? What grade level standards are is a game. Like we made up the standards. And so the reality is that the world stopped. And it is true that some kids continued to quote unquote grow in those areas and maybe other kids didn't. I do think we don't want to undervalue the ways in which kids grew and had experiences that were really important. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing that part of what young people became aware of during this pause in the world was some of the inequities that existed, or the fact that a vaccine could be developed in a year and a half, and what was that process, or got to know their communities in new ways because there was time and the world was shut down. So I think we want to be careful about saying kids didn't learn and that it was all a net negative. Yes, there are areas they didn't grow as much, but that's human development in general, right? Is that we're always growing at different rates, in different paces across different areas of our lives. And in some ways, if we look at history, the reality is that there has been kind of devastation, whether it's in the form of war or kind of other disruptions at various points where there might have been developmental delays because young people weren't out or having the kinds of quote unquote healthy experiences we would want them to. So now I think the question becomes how, and this is why it's even more important that our systems are adaptable. How do we say, all right, actually kids coming in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, you might be all over the place in reading and in literacy and mathematics. How can we organize a school structure? I've been thinking about this a lot. How could you organize a school structure where you're teaching math at the same time every single day and a young person at different levels? And a young person could move up and down in kind of levels based on where they were. And it doesn't matter if they're in sixth, seventh, or eighth grade, because they're all over the place. And at the same time, how could you then use the half day where you're not teaching literacy and math to give a lot more choices and to say, you know what, we might do more social and emotional or group therapeutic work for kids who really need more of that right now, and maybe giving other students opportunities to choose areas that they want to grow in, right? I think it's a question of, can we imagine how we, again, if the young people are at the center, what do they need? And how do we create systems that are flexible and adaptive enough to give them access to the experiences they need to kind of catch up and get where we need them to be in terms of being healthy emotionally, healthy psychologically, and continuing to learn and grow in ways that let them get out of high school and continue to learn and grow. So I don't
And
know if that's Pollyannish. I really don't, but I feel like that is a question we could be asking ourselves.
well, I think that generally is the question that we're asking ourselves. And you have a beautiful collection that I'll go ahead and put in the notes underneath the interview, that are asking things like, what are we doing and why? Like, what's the purpose of education here? And one that also is intriguing based on the conversation that we're having right now is, what do we believe and or know about how learning happens? And so I think the interesting dynamic is that there is a level of neuroscience we can use to inform our learning principles, our instructional practices. But we also need to step back and understand that the industrial schedule of how we use time got what we have gotten so far. And at some point, in order to get to that next level of vision of what education could be, it does require that level of systemic adaptation and flexibility that you were speaking about a minute ago. And ultimately, I thought there was a few really powerful examples pre-COVID. I think the wild card that I'd love to talk about before we are ending part two is, you know, as we're moving through this pandemic, post-pandemic experience, how are the educators feeling about the next generation of what school looks like? So I don't know what your reflections are based on what you've been seeing on the ground.
I mean, in general, I think educators are feeling pretty exhausted at the moment, and I think it's hard for any of us to live into our imaginations in a powerful way when we're exhausted. I think what we saw, however, during COVID that could be a lesson, and there's a report that's just come out from an organization called Next Generation Learning Challenges, which maybe you can link. It was called "What Made Them So Prepared," and it was an examination of districts and programs across the United States, rural, urban, all kinds of contexts that seemed to pivot particularly well, and that seemed to take care of their educators and their students and their communities more powerfully than many other places that seemed to be caught flat-footed and kind of were just waiting, kind of like, what do we need to do and how do we do it? And what was interesting is, you mentioned those questions about what are we doing and why, and what do we think about development and learning. I think of that as an instructional model that goes all the way from purpose, all the way to what do adults need to know and be able to do, and what are the systems. And the places that seemed to pivot really well had instructional models that already reflected these kind of ecological design principles that had already established cultures of, there's no such thing as failure. It's that we try things and some work and then we adapt and we keep going. They had established systems where, they said, look, in order to take care of young people, we need to take care of our adults. And then they created experiences for adults that mirrored what they wanted the adults to create for young people. And what that enabled was the ability in this moment of disruption of COVID to really pivot and then pivot again and pivot again as the world changed, without it requiring educators to give 200% of themselves as individuals, because they were supported by systems. And so I think in places like that, I think educators are feeling excited and kind of like, yes, we can do this.
Yeah.
I think for many other educators, that is not the experience right now. And what I'd love to invite, right, is more conversations and more inspiration for them, not that they were doing anything wrong, but rather how do we all become advocates? And I say we being parents and communities as well, to say, actually, we need to do something different so that our educators can feel reinvigorated to kind of move into this. And as we bring in the next generation of educators, that we bring in people who are excited by that to work alongside our more experienced educators to kind of build something different.
Well, from the lens of optimism and hope and aspiration for what the future of schooling can look like, our part 3 is going to be focusing on what you've seen happen since the release of the book last year, and to give a couple of examples and ideas for folks that are really invested in this work. So we'll tune in now to part 3. So thanks so much, Ulcca, for joining us.